I found an old lottery ticket in a coat I hadn't worn in 2 years. I almost threw it out, but decided to check the numbers. The numbers matched, and I had won $88 million. When I called, they answered with 3 words. "Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also, let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I want to tell you something I've never told anyone in full. Not my therapist, not my attorney, not even Martha, who was there for every single moment that came after. I want to tell you the whole truth from the beginning, because the beginning matters more than people think. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 52 years old. I'm a school librarian in Dunmore, Pennsylvania, and for most of my adult life, that sentence was the entirety of my biography. I lived in a beige 2-bedroom house on Clover Street that I'd bought with my ex-husband Tom 18 years ago and kept after the divorce. I drove a 2016 Honda Civic with a cracked dashboard that I kept meaning to fix. I had a garden in the back that produced more zucchini than any one person could reasonably eat. My life was quiet. I used to think quiet was a polite word for small. Now I know it's the word for mine. My sister Linda never let me forget how small she thought my life was. Linda Harmon, née Mitchell, is 3 years older than me and has spent the better part of those 3 years acting like the gap is 30. She married Greg Harmon when she was 26, a man who made a lot of money in commercial real estate and lost very little of it. They lived in a 4-bedroom colonial in Clarks Summit, drove matching SUVs, and vacationed in places with names I'd seen in magazine spreads. Linda was not cruel in the way that makes people gasp. She was cruel in the way that makes you doubt your own memory of events, the kind that leaves no fingerprints. I remember the Thanksgiving 2 years ago with painful clarity. We were at Linda's house. We were always at Linda's house because her dining room table seated 12 and mine seated 4. She'd made the turkey, and Greg had opened an expensive bottle of something. And at some point, the conversation turned to the Powerball jackpot. It was enormous that week, somewhere north of $200 million, and the news was running segments about it constantly. "I bought a ticket," I said, laughing a little. 2 of them, actually, at the BP on Wheeler. Maybe this'll finally be my turn. I said it the way people say things like that, lightly, as a joke against themselves. But Linda looked at me across the table in a way that wasn't light at all. Her expression shifted for just a fraction of a second, something sliding behind her eyes like a key turning in a lock. Then she smiled and said, "Oh, Sarah." In that tone she reserved for things she found charming in a sad way, and the conversation moved on. I didn't think about it again. Not then. I thought about it on the first Saturday of October, nearly 2 years later, when I was cleaning out my bedroom closet and pulled a camel-colored wool coat off its hanger, a coat I hadn't worn since I'd bought my newer gray one the previous winter. I checked the pockets out of habit, the way you do when you're deciding whether something goes to Goodwill or back on the rod. The right pocket held a gas station receipt for $14.37. The left pocket held a folded lottery ticket, soft at the creases from having been washed at some point without my noticing. I almost threw both of them away. My hand was literally over the wastebasket. Instead, I sat down on the edge of my bed and smoothed the ticket open against my knee. 5 white ball numbers and 1 red Powerball. I stared at them for a moment, thinking about nothing in particular, then went to my laptop and pulled up the Pennsylvania Lottery's website. I found the past winning numbers. I found November 14th of last year, which was when, I could see from the receipt date, I'd bought the ticket. I looked at the numbers on my screen. Then I looked at the ticket in my hand. I looked back at the screen. I set the ticket down. I picked it up again. I counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the Powerball. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. $88 million, an unclaimed jackpot. The claim deadline, November 14th of this year, 34 days. I sat completely still for what must have been 10 minutes. Then I did something I would later understand was my first and most critical mistake. Not because it ruined anything, but because it revealed everything too soon. I reached for my phone and called my sister. Linda picked up on the second ring. I hadn't even spoken. I was still drawing breath to say, "Linda, you won't believe," when she said it. 3 words, flat and certain, as if she'd been waiting for this exact call. "I know already." The room went very cold. I said nothing. I ended the call. And for a long time, I just sat there, holding an $88 million piece of paper in a beige bedroom on Clover Street, wondering what, exactly, my sister already knew, and how long she had known it. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark with the lottery ticket tucked inside the zippered pocket of my winter coat, the new gray one, which I then hung at the very back of my closet, behind my summer clothes and a box of Tom's old books I'd never gotten around to donating. Was it paranoid? Perhaps. But I know already had a way of making paranoia feel like common sense. What did Linda know? That was the question I turned over and over in the darkness. Had she seen the numbers somewhere? Had she, at some point in the last year, looked up that Thanksgiving conversation and gone online, the way people do with idle curiosity? Had she remembered my offhand comment about buying 2 tickets at the BP on Wheeler, noted the jackpot date, searched the unclaimed prizes list? Because I discovered in the earliest hours of Sunday morning, when I finally gave up on sleep and opened my laptop, that the Pennsylvania Lottery publishes unclaimed prizes. You can look them up. Any person in the state can go online and see that a winning Powerball ticket sold at a specific retailer in a specific county has not yet been claimed. The retailer is named. The county is named. The prize amount is named. The BP on Wheeler Avenue, Lackawanna County, $88 million. It had been sitting there on a public website for nearly 11 months. And Linda, organized, detail-obsessed Linda, who tracked things the way other people breathe, had almost certainly seen it. I pushed my laptop away and pressed my hands flat on the kitchen table and thought about what this meant. It meant Linda had known for months that a winning ticket was out there somewhere, bought by someone who'd used the BP on Wheeler. It meant that when I'd mentioned buying tickets at that gas station 2 years ago, that detail had lodged in her memory like a splinter. It meant she'd been waiting. Maybe she'd been planning. And then I called her, like a fool, and confirmed everything. I felt sick for approximately 40 minutes. Then something in me went quiet and hard, the way a door goes when you push it shut properly and hear it click. Fear is useful for exactly as long as it sharpens your thinking. After that, it's just noise. I made coffee. I opened a fresh document on my laptop. I started writing things down. What I had, 1 lottery ticket, verified by my own comparison of the numbers. 1 receipt from the BP on Wheeler dated November 13th, the day before the drawing, which placed me at that location at that time. My name on the gas station's loyalty card account, because I am a creature of habit who always swipes the little keychain fob. 34 days remaining to file a claim. What I didn't have, Any understanding of how to claim a prize of this magnitude, any knowledge of whether I could do so without my name becoming public, or any certainty about what my sister was planning. I started reading. I read for 4 hours straight. I learned that Pennsylvania allows lottery winners to claim prizes through a legal entity, a trust or an LLC, rather than as an individual. I learned that this is not a loophole. It's a designed feature specifically to protect winners' privacy. I learned that the Lottery Commission verifies the ticket, not the person. What matters is that the claim is properly structured and filed within the deadline. I learned, most importantly, that this was not something I should attempt to navigate alone. By Monday morning, I had made 3 decisions. First, I would not contact Linda again until I understood what I was dealing with. Second, I would go to work and behave normally, because the worst thing I could do was disappear from my routine and give anyone reason to wonder. Third, I needed an attorney, a good one, in a city far enough from Dunmore that I was unlikely to run into anyone who knew my family. I thought about Pittsburgh. Then I thought about Philadelphia. I chose Philadelphia because it was farther. On my lunch break Monday, sitting in my car in the school parking lot with the engine running for heat, I searched online for lottery attorneys in Philadelphia. I found a firm, Warren and Associates, specializing in estate law and high-value asset protection, and I looked up Daniel Warren specifically. Harvard Law, 21 years of practice, 3 published articles on trust structures for anonymous prize claims. I called the main number and spoke to a receptionist in a voice I kept very, very steady. I gave my first name only. I said I needed an appointment to discuss a time-sensitive matter involving a significant asset and that I'd prefer an in-person consultation. She offered me Thursday at 2 o'clock. I said yes, hung up, and sat in my car for a moment, watching the October light move across the school's brick exterior. 32 days. I had 32 days, an attorney appointment on Thursday, and a ticket tucked inside a coat in the back of a closet on Clover Street. For the first time since Saturday, I felt something other than fear. I felt, with a clarity that surprised me, like myself. The drive to Philadelphia takes about 2 hours from Dunmore on a clear day. I left at 11, which gave me time to stop for gas and still arrive early enough to sit in a coffee shop across from the law firm and breathe for 20 minutes before walking in. Daniel Warren was younger than I'd imagined, maybe 45, with wire-rimmed glasses and the quiet, measured manner of someone who had spent decades hearing things that surprised him and had trained himself not to show it. His office was all dark wood and stacked files, which I found reassuring. It looked like a place where serious things were handled seriously. I laid everything on the table. The ticket, still in a protective plastic sleeve I'd bought at the drugstore. The receipt, a printout of the lottery's unclaimed prize listing, and the BP's loyalty card records, which I had requested from the retailer's app that morning, and which showed a transaction at that location on November 13th at 6:47 p.m., linked to my account. Daniel Warren looked at everything carefully. He did not say congratulations. What he said was, "Before we discuss structure, I need to understand your timeline and your threat environment." I told him about Linda. I told him about the 3 words. I watched him write notes in a small leather notebook, and his expression didn't change. But his pen slowed when I described her saying, "I know already," before I'd spoken a single word. "She's been watching the unclaimed prizes list," he said. "That's what I think. And she knows the ticket originated at a retailer near you. She knows I said I bought tickets there 2 years ago, at Thanksgiving." He set his pen down. "Ms. Mitchell, What I'm about to describe to you is entirely legal and specifically designed for situations like this. We will form a limited liability company, named something entirely unrelated to you. The LLC will be the claimant of record. Your name will appear only in the trust documents, which are sealed. We will make an appointment with the Pennsylvania Lottery Commission. We will present the properly authenticated ticket and documentation, and we will begin the claims process. How long does that take? With the deadline 31 days out, we move immediately. I'd like to file the LLC paperwork by end of week. I agreed. I signed a retainer agreement. I drove home with my hands tight on the steering wheel and something resolving slowly in my chest. What I did not know on that Thursday afternoon was that Linda had already moved. I found out the following Tuesday, and I found out because of Martha Chen. Martha is my closest friend, has been since we taught an adult literacy class together 8 years ago, and she is constitutionally incapable of sitting on information she thinks I need to have. She called me that Tuesday evening, her voice careful in the way it gets when she's delivering something difficult. I ran into Greg at Wegmans today, she said. He was buying wine, which is very Greg, and he came up to me and made small talk, which is very not Greg, because Greg barely acknowledges my existence as a rule. He asked how you were doing. He asked whether you'd seemed stressed lately. He asked, she paused. He asked whether you'd mentioned anything about a financial situation. I sat very still. Martha, I said, what did you tell him? I said you seemed completely fine and that you'd been complaining about a leaky faucet, which is true, by the way. You should really fix that faucet. I almost laughed. Did he say anything else? He said to tell you that he and Linda were thinking of you. She paused. Sarah, what is going on? I'll tell you soon, I said. I promise. But right now, I need you to do one thing. If either of them contacts you again, tell me immediately. She agreed without asking why, because that is the kind of friend Martha Chen is. But that wasn't the most important thing I learned that week. The most important thing came from Daniel Warren, who had hired a private investigator, standard practice in his firm for high-value asset claims with a contested element, and who called me Friday morning with something that made the whole shape of the situation snap into focus. The investigator had found an appointment. 3 weeks before I found the ticket, Greg Harmon had met with a family law attorney in Scranton, not a lottery specialist, not an estate attorney, but a family law attorney who also handled civil disputes and contract claims. The appointment was in the attorney's calendar, access through a legal discovery process I will not pretend to fully understand. Greg had consulted on the question of whether a verbal agreement between family members to share lottery winnings could be enforced in Pennsylvania. He had used a hypothetical. But the hypothetical, as Daniel described it, was precise. If one family member mentioned buying lottery tickets aloud in front of others, and if there was an established pattern of financial sharing within the family, could a claim of co-ownership be argued? The attorney had told him probably not. Without something in writing, it was a very weak case. Greg had apparently thanked him and left. But now I knew. They weren't just watching. They were building something. They were planning to walk in after I made my claim and argue that my offhand Thanksgiving comment constituted a declaration of shared intent. I sat with that information for a long time. Then I called Daniel and told him to move faster. We moved faster. The LLC was filed in Delaware by the end of that week. Maple Ridge Assets, LLC, a name chosen for being completely unmemorable. Daniel structured it as a single-member company with me as the sole owner, held inside a revocable trust, The trust was named the RJM Family Trust, which were the initials of my maternal grandmother, Ruth Jean Mitchell, because Daniel said you should always put something meaningful where no one else will think to look. The appointment with the Pennsylvania Lottery Commission was set for a Wednesday morning, 22 days before the deadline, in Middletown at their main offices. I drove down the night before and stayed in a Holiday Inn. I brought the ticket, the receipt, the loyalty card records, Daniel, and a manila folder thick enough to make a sound when I set it on the table. The commission staff were professional. They verified the ticket under ultraviolet light. They checked the barcode. They reviewed the documentation. The process took 3.5 hours, during which time I sat very straight in a chair and drank 2 cups of bad coffee and thought about my grandmother's name in a trust document. When it was done, the claims officer, or a woman named Ms. Patel, who had, I imagined, seen everything, looked at me over the rims of her reading glasses and said, "Your claim is accepted and will be processed within 15 to 20 business days. Congratulations, Ms. Mitchell." The lump sum payment after taxes would be approximately $52 million. $52 million. I shook Ms. Patel's hand, walked out to the parking lot with Daniel, and stood in the pale November air for a moment without speaking. A car alarm went off somewhere. A pigeon walked past my feet with complete indifference to the moment. Life continuing. "Are you all right?" Daniel asked. "Yes," I said, and then, "When do they announce it?" "They're required to publish the winner," he said. "But the claimant of record is Maple Ridge Assets, LLC. Unless someone specifically investigates the trust structure, which would require a court order, your name doesn't appear. How long before Linda and Greg figure it out?" He gave me a measured look. "Approximately the moment it's published online." He was right. It took 4 days. The call came on a Saturday morning, which felt somehow on the nose. Not from Linda, from Greg. He didn't bother with small talk. "We know it was claimed," he said. "We know it was claimed through an LLC, and we know it was yours, Sarah, so let's not play games." I was standing in my kitchen, holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold while I was reading, and I felt something tighten in my sternum and then deliberately release, like exhaling. "Greg," I said, "what exactly is it you want?" "We want what's fair. What we're entitled to. You announced at Thanksgiving that you were going to buy those tickets. We were all there. That creates..." "It creates nothing," I said. "You consulted an attorney who told you exactly that." A silence. Short, but the kind that changes a room. "We're going to file a civil claim," Greg said. "We'll tell every court in Pennsylvania that you acknowledged those tickets were a family purchase. We'll make this very expensive and very public for you." "You should talk to your attorney again before you do that," I said. "Tell him you've been monitoring public unclaimed prize lists to track a family member's potential winnings. Tell him about the private investigator you hired to look into my finances last month." "Yes," I said, because I heard him start to speak. "I know about that, too." Another silence, longer this time. "You're making a mistake," Greg said. "I'll take that under advisement," I said, and ended the call. My hands were trembling, but they were trembling the way they do after you've run a long distance, not from weakness, but from the effort of having done the thing. Linda called 20 minutes later. She did not threaten. She cried. She said she couldn't believe I would do this to our family, that she'd always been there for me, that this was a betrayal. It was a more sophisticated attack than Greg's, and it almost worked. There was a version of me, maybe the version that had existed a month ago, who would have folded under Linda's tears the way paper folds under water. But I had spent 4 weeks becoming someone slightly harder than I used to be, and so I listened until she was done, and then I said, "I love you, Linda. I'll talk to you when we can talk calmly." And I hung up. Daniel called an hour later. I described both conversations. He told me I had handled them exactly right and that he was formally putting Greg and Linda on notice that any contact regarding the lottery prize was to be directed to his office only. That evening, I drove to the park near my house, the one with the duck pond that freezes in January, and I sat on a bench until it got dark. I watched the water move. I thought about nothing in particular. I decided I was going to give myself 3 days before I thought about any of this again. I drove home, made soup from a can, watched a nature documentary about migration patterns, and slept for 9 hours. It was the best sleep I'd had in a month. 3 days turned into 4, and on the 4th day, Linda appeared at my door. Not with Greg, alone, which I recognized immediately as a tactical decision. She was carrying a bottle of the wine I used to love in my 20s, a Bordeaux that cost more than my weekly grocery bill, and she was wearing her softest expression, the one she deployed when she wanted something she knew she couldn't take by force. "I just want to talk," she said, standing on my front step in her cashmere coat, the November wind lifting her hair in a way that was, objectively, unfair. No Greg. No attorneys, just us. I looked at her for a moment. Then I opened the door wider and let her in, because the alternative, closing it in her face, would have given me 30 seconds of satisfaction and handed her a permanent narrative about how I'd become a different person since the money. I hadn't become a different person. I had become a more accurate version of myself. We sat at the kitchen table. She opened the wine. I accepted a glass because refusing it would have felt like theater. She talked. She talked about our childhood, the summers at our grandparents' place in upstate New York, the way our mother used to make Sunday breakfasts, the time Sarah fell off the backyard fence and Linda had carried her inside and cleaned the wound and made up a story about it so their father wouldn't be angry. She was very good at this. She always had been. "I'm not trying to take anything from you," she said. "I want you to understand that. We've always been a team. You and me. That's all I wanted, to be part of it." I listened to all of it. I let her talk until there was nothing left to say. Then I set my wine glass down and looked at her. "Linda," I said, "Greg consulted a family law attorney 6 weeks ago about how to legally contest a lottery prize that neither of you has any documented claim to. He had a private investigator look into my finances. You've been monitoring the unclaimed prizes list for nearly a year." I kept my voice even. "That's not being a team. That's building a case." Her face did something complicated. A cascade of emotions I'd spent a lifetime learning to read. Surprise that I knew. Recalibration. And then briefly, something that might have been genuine hurt before the mask went back up. "You had someone watching us," she said. "I had someone protecting me," I said. "There's a difference." She left the wine and left the house, and I sat for a while at the kitchen table after she was gone. The thing about Linda's visits is that they always leave a residue, even when you've held your ground. Some people are like that. They inhabit a space and don't fully leave when their body does. I called Martha that evening. We talked for 2 hours, which is a thing we do maybe 3 times a year, and she made me feel, not better exactly, but less alone in the specific way that only a long friendship can produce. She asked good questions. She laughed at the right moments. When I told her about Linda showing up with the wine, Martha said, "Of course she brought a bottle. She always leads with a prop." I also, that week, made an appointment with Dr. Karen Holloway, a therapist I'd seen briefly after my divorce, and whose office was clean and quiet and smelled like cedar. I hadn't been back in 5 years. I told her everything, from the Thanksgiving comment to the coat to the 3 words to the accepted claim. And she listened the way she always did, without urgency, without rushing toward conclusions. "What do you notice about how you're feeling right now?" she asked. "Not about Linda, about yourself." I thought about it. "Steady," I said, which surprises me. I thought I'd feel more disrupted. "Why do you think you don't?" "Because I know what I have," I said. "I know what's mine. Nobody's confusion about that changes the fact." She wrote something in her notebook. She said, "Hold on to that." I intended to. They came together in December, on a Saturday morning when the first serious snow of the season was beginning to come down over Dunmore. I watched their matching silver SUV pull up in front of my house and felt a very specific kind of tired, not exhaustion, but the tiredness of knowing something is coming and having to raise yourself to meet it anyway. I let them in. I did not offer coffee. Greg had dressed carefully, no suit, but a good sweater, the kind that signals approachability. Linda carried nothing this time. No wine, no props. She'd decided on a different tactic: simplicity, sincerity, or the performance of it. They sat on my couch, and I sat in the armchair across from them, and Greg started. He said they'd had time to think. He said they'd been too aggressive, and he could understand why I'd been defensive. He said, and this was the pivot, delivered with the casual certainty of someone who had rehearsed it, that they weren't interested in litigation, that all of this could be resolved quietly. Family stays family. "We're thinking 50-50, he said. "You and Linda, the way it should have been from the start. Half and half, 26 million each. Nobody goes to court. Nobody goes to the press. Nobody has to deal with any of this becoming public." I looked at him, then at Linda, who was watching me with the careful expression of someone who has wound a clock and is waiting to hear it strike. "And if I say no?" I said. "Then we file the claim," Greg said. His voice had shifted, only slightly, but I'd been listening for it. The gentleness was a lid. Underneath was something he was keeping down by effort. "And we talked to the press about how a woman who won $88 million cut her own sister out of the money. We talk about how you stood at our Thanksgiving table and told us you were buying those tickets. We make sure everyone in this city knows what you did, and we let people decide for themselves." The threat landed in the room like a stone landing in still water. I watched the ripples, and I thought, is that all? Not carelessly, carefully. Because I had spent 2 months becoming someone who had thought all of this through, had war-gamed every version of this conversation, had sat in a therapist's office and in a park by a duck pond and in a law firm in Philadelphia, and had arrived at a very clear understanding of what I had and what they had and how much their threats were actually worth. "I see," I said. "Greg, you're describing a press campaign built on the claim that an offhand comment at a dinner party constitutes a legal agreement. Every journalist who looks into it will find that you consulted an attorney who told you it doesn't. They'll find that you hired a private investigator. They'll find the civil consultation on record. And then they'll write a very different story than the one you're imagining." Greg's jaw tightened. "You can't prove—" "I can," I said. "I have." Linda reached out and put her hand on Greg's arm, a steadying gesture or a signal. Then she looked at me with something in her eyes that might have been, in another life, the actual feeling she was performing. "Sarah," she said softly, "this is going to destroy our relationship." "Linda," I said, equally softly. "I think you should take some time to consider what destroyed it." The silence stretched. Greg stood first, then Linda, with the deliberate control of people who are furious and do not want to be seen to be furious. Greg straightened his good sweater. Linda picked up her purse. At the door, Greg turned back. "You're going to regret this," he said. It was such a standard thing to say that I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "Drive safe," I said. "The roads are bad." I watched their SUV pull away through the front window. Outside, the snow was coming down in thick, quiet curtains over Clover Street. I stood there for a moment, my hands in my cardigan pockets, and I felt it. A small, bright thread of fear, thin and real because they weren't done. I knew they weren't done. But the fear did not soften my resolve. It sharpened it, the way cold air sharpens everything it touches. I picked up my phone and texted Daniel 3 words. They made contact. He replied within 4 minutes. "I'll file the protective order Monday." Good, I thought. Let them come. The decisive moment came on a Thursday in January, in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Scranton. And it came because Greg Harmon made an error that I had, by that point, been quietly expecting for weeks. What Greg did was this. He found a notary. Specifically, he found a notary public in Carbondale named Raymond Solt, who was apparently willing for a sum that our investigator later confirmed was $8,000 cash to backdate and certify a document. The document was a 1-page family agreement, ostensibly signed at Linda and Greg's house on the evening of November 14th, 2 years ago, the night of the Powerball drawing, and it stated that Sarah Mitchell, Linda Harmon, and Greg Harmon had agreed verbally and in writing to share any lottery winnings equally among the 3 of them. It bore 3 signatures, Greg's, Linda's, and a version of mine that was, to put it charitably, ambitious. They filed it with their civil suit on the 2nd Monday of January. Daniel called me within the hour. His voice was the quietest I'd ever heard it. "They've submitted a fraudulent document," he said. "They had a notary certify a forged signature. This changes the nature of the proceedings entirely." "What do we do?" I said. "We let them walk into the hearing," he said, "and then we show them what we have." I spent the nights before Thursday going over everything in my head, not from anxiety, but from the methodical habit of someone who has learned not to leave things to chance. I thought about Raymond Solt signing his name to a lie for $8,000. I thought about Greg on the phone with him, making that calculation, deciding it was worth it. I thought about Linda sitting across the kitchen table from her husband and agreeing that this was the plan they would execute. And I thought about the photograph on Martha's phone, taken in a moment of ordinary happiness, 4 people around a dinner table with wine glasses, embedded with a timestamp that would undo everything they had built. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday. I arrived 20 minutes early with Daniel, his paralegal, and a banker's box of documentation. I wore a gray wool blazer and flat shoes, and I carried nothing in my hands. I wanted to look like a woman who had nothing to hide because she wasn't hiding anything. Linda and Greg arrived with their attorney, a man named Prescott who was good in the practiced way of people who had handled many cases and not necessarily won all of them. He gave me a brief professional nod across the room. Greg did not look at me at all. Linda looked at me once, quickly, and then looked away at something on the far wall that was not there. What Prescott did not know, and what Greg and Linda did not know, was what Daniel had assembled in the preceding 6 weeks. He had obtained Raymond Solt's phone records, which showed 3 calls from Greg Harmon's cell phone in the week before the document was notarized. He had a statement from a colleague of Solt's who had been present when Solt described the transaction. He had a handwriting analysis from a certified forensic examiner who had compared the signature on the document to every available sample of my handwriting and determined, in language that used phrases like definitively inconsistent and probability of forgery exceeds 98%, that the signature was not mine. He also had something I had given him myself, a photograph taken at Linda and Greg's house on the night of November 14th, 2 years ago, which Martha had sent to me from her phone because she had been there too, invited to the same dinner. In the photograph taken at 9:47 p.m., all 4 of us, Sarah, Linda, Greg, and Martha, were sitting around the table with wine glasses. The document they had submitted claimed to have been signed at that table at 9:30 p.m. on that same night. Martha's photo, with its embedded metadata, put me at that table doing nothing but having dinner. There was no paper, there were no pens, there were no signatures. Daniel presented everything methodically, without theater, which was the right choice. There is something more devastating about a calm voice delivering catastrophic information than any dramatic flourish. I watched him lay each document on the table in front of Magistrate Harrington. The phone records, the forensic report, the photographic evidence with its metadata clearly printed. And I watched Prescott's posture change by increments, the way a structure settles when something beneath it shifts. I watched Prescott absorb this information over the course of 45 minutes. I watched him lean over and speak quietly to Greg, whose face had gone the color of old chalk. I watched Linda's composure, which she had been maintaining with visible effort throughout, begin to crack at the edges. She pressed her lips together. She looked at her hands on the table. At one point, she looked at me directly, and it was not the look of someone who was angry. It was the look of someone who has just understood, fully and finally, that a thing cannot be undone. Greg, to his credit, lasted longer than I expected. He tried the angle that the photograph proved nothing about what happened before 9:47. He tried the angle that handwriting analysis was imprecise. He tried the angle that phone records between friends were not evidence of conspiracy. Prescott presented each argument with the careful neutrality of an attorney who has been hired to make arguments and is doing his job, but there was something in his voice, a faint flatness, a professional distance. That told me he had already understood where this was going. The judge, a magistrate named Harrington who had the particular patience of someone who had watched people talk themselves into corners too many times to be surprised, let him finish. Then she looked at Greg over her glasses and said, in a voice like a door closing, "Counsel, I think we need to discuss the document your client submitted." That was when Greg Harmon came apart. Not dramatically. He didn't shout, didn't stand up. He simply looked at Linda, and Linda looked at him, and something passed between them that was the exact opposite of a plan. And Greg said, "Linda told me it would work. She said she'd taken care of it." Linda's face went absolutely white. Prescott put his pen down on the table. I said nothing. I folded my hands, and I said nothing at all. I had waited 2 months for this room, this moment, this silence. I was not going to fill it with anything less than the truth, and the truth was already there, spread across the table in documents and timestamps and the collapsed remains of a plan that should never have been made. What happened after that Thursday was not quick, because nothing in the legal system is quick, but it was, in every meaningful sense, complete. Magistrate Harrington referred the matter of the forged document to the district attorney's office the same afternoon. The referral was made in writing, formally, before the hearing had even fully concluded. a procedural step that Prescott acknowledged with a nod and a tightened jaw, because it meant the conversation had moved to a place he was no longer able to manage. Greg and Linda left the building without speaking to me. I watched them cross the parking lot through the conference room window, two figures in winter coats moving toward a silver SUV, not touching, not looking at each other. And I thought about how long they must have believed this plan would work, how certain they must have been. Raymond Solt, who had apparently no gift for loyalty when faced with the prospect of criminal charges, cooperated fully within 48 hours. He confirmed that Greg Harmon had contacted him, described the nature of the transaction, produced the cash receipts he had kept for reasons he himself could not fully explain, and provided a statement that was so thorough and detailed that Prescott, from what Daniel told me later, spent a very long Monday in his office reviewing his options. The receipts, Daniel said, were the part that nobody expected. Solt had kept meticulous records of a transaction he should have burned every trace of, which said something about the particular kind of recklessness that lives in people who believe they will never be found out. Greg and Linda were charged with fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Greg was additionally charged with suborning perjury for his role in commissioning the notarized statement. Their attorney, a different one, because Prescott withdrew from the case once the criminal element became clear, which I found out later was standard practice and not, as I briefly imagined, the legal profession's equivalent of a consciency, negotiated a plea agreement over the following 3 months. The negotiations, Daniel told me, were not smooth. Greg's new counsel made several attempts to characterize the forged document as a miscommunication, as a family matter that had been mishandled rather than deliberately falsified. The DA's office was not interested in that characterization. They had Raymond Solt's statement, they had the phone records, they had the forensic handwriting report, and they had the photograph with its timestamp. There was not much room to maneuver. Greg pled guilty to fraud and received 18 months of probation, a $50,000 fine, and 120 hours of community service. Linda pled guilty to a reduced charge of document fraud and received 12 months of probation and 80 hours of community service. Neither of them went to prison. I will not pretend that I found this entirely satisfying. There is a specific disappointment in watching people who have done something genuinely wrong be held accountable in a way that feels, by ordinary human measures, insufficient. I mentioned this to Daniel once, carefully, not bitterly, just as a fact, and he looked at me over his glasses and said, "The plea arrangement is actually better for you. No trial means no press circus, which means Maple Ridge Assets stays clean." He was right. He was almost always right, which was why I had hired him. I paid his invoice and let the feeling go. The civil suit was dropped. Every claim Linda and Greg had made to any portion of the prize was dismissed with prejudice, which means, Daniel was very clear about this, they cannot bring it again. Not in a different form, not under a different theory, not if they find a more creative attorney or a more sympathetic judge. It's done. That word, dismissed with prejudice, had a finality to it that I turned over in my mind for days afterward. The way you might turn over a stone that has been somewhere heavy for a long time and look at what is underneath. The lottery funds, $52 million after taxes, were transferred to Maple Ridge Assets, LLC in February, on a gray Tuesday morning when I was at work shelving books in the school library. Daniel texted me when it cleared. It's in. I read the text between Goodnight Moon and Charlotte's Web, set my phone back in my pocket, finished the cart, and then went to the staff bathroom and sat on the closed lid of a toilet for about 3 minutes, doing nothing at all. I thought about the camel-colored wool coat. I thought about my hand over the wastebasket. I thought about the gas station receipt for $14.37. Unremarkable. The receipt for an ordinary errand on an ordinary Thursday evening, and the folded ticket beside it, soft at the creases, patient in the way that inanimate objects are patient because they have no other option. There was a moment, just one, where I thought about calling Linda, not to gloat. I want to be very precise about that. I thought about calling her because we had been sisters for 52 years, and some part of me, some stubborn, irreducible part that the whole experience had not managed to extinguish, was sorry for what had happened to us. Not for what I had done, for what she had chosen. There is a particular sadness in watching someone you have loved decide that what you have is worth more to them than who you are. And I had been sitting with that sadness for months, and I was tired of it, but I was not finished with it yet. But I didn't call, because I knew what I would have said was true, and I also knew that truth was not the thing she could receive from me right now, and probably not for a very long time. Instead, I drove home. I made pasta. I opened a bottle of wine, a perfectly ordinary one, $12, from the grocery store 2 blocks away. And I sat at my kitchen table on Clover Street and thought about my grandmother, Ruth Jean Mitchell, whose initials were in a trust document that now held $52 million. And I wondered what she would have said about all of it. She was a quiet woman, my grandmother, a practical woman who grew things and kept things and knew the value of holding on. She would not have made a speech. She would have sat across from me with her coffee and looked at me in that steady way she had, and after a moment she would have said simply, "You held on. That's the whole thing. You just held on." I poured a second glass of wine. Outside on Clover Street, the February dark was complete and cold and mine. I sat with it for a long time. The year that followed was the quietest revolution of my life. I did not quit my job immediately. This surprised people when I told them later. Martha actually laughed, that full, helpless laugh she has. But it felt important to me to finish the school year. I had a group of 5th graders who were halfway through a reading program we'd started in the fall, and it seemed wrong to simply vanish from their lives because mine had changed. So I stayed until June, and on my last day, the librarian's aide, a 19-year-old named Deja, brought me a card signed by every student in the program, and I stood in the stacks with it and felt very clearly that I had made the right decision about almost everything. In July, I bought a house. Not ostentatiously, a craftsman-style home on 3 acres outside of Dunmore, with a proper garden and a covered porch, and a kitchen that had been renovated by someone who understood what kitchens were for. I paid for it in cash, through the trust, and when the deed came through, I sat on the porch steps in the summer evening and listened to the sound of the property. Insects, a far-off tractor, the occasional complaint of a bird, and felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time, which was simply that I was home. I established 3 charitable funds in my grandmother's name. One for adult literacy programs in Lackawanna County, one for school libraries in underfunded districts across Pennsylvania, and one for women navigating financial transitions after divorce. The kind of small, specific, invisible crisis that nobody talks about until you've been through it. I gave the management of the funds to a nonprofit board, and I stayed involved without becoming the story. I also did something purely selfish and wonderful. I traveled. Not extravagantly, not immediately, but in the autumn I went to Portugal for 3 weeks with Martha, and we walked through Lisbon and ate things and stayed in a hotel where the sheets felt like water. And Martha said on the fourth day, sitting at a cafe table overlooking the river, "Sarah, you look like yourself." "I've always looked like myself," I said. "No," she said. "You looked like a woman who had learned to take up exactly the right amount of space. Now you look like a woman who isn't counting anymore." I thought about that for a long time afterward. She was right, in the way that good friends so often are. What happened to Linda and Greg unfolded, as these things do, without my help. The criminal charges, even resolved through plea agreements, became a matter of public record, and in the world Greg Harmon had built his life in, public records have consequences. 2 of his commercial real estate partners reviewed their association after the news circulated in local business circles and declined to renew their contracts. A property development project he'd been anchoring in Clark Summit fell through when a financing partner withdrew. Not, the official statement said, for any specific reason, but everyone understood the specific reason. By the following spring, Greg had sold 2 of his investment properties under pressure and was in restructuring discussions with his creditors. The Colonial in Clark Summit went on the market in the summer. I saw the listing online not because I searched for it, but because Martha sent it to me with a single raised eyebrow emoji and no other comment. Linda, from what filtered back through mutual acquaintances, was spending a great deal of time with a therapist of her own. I hope the therapist was a good one. I genuinely hoped that. The thing about finally being free of someone's gravity is that you can afford to wish them well. You're no longer close enough to be pulled. We did not speak. A year after the hearing, she sent me a card in the mail. No return address, but I recognized her handwriting. The card had a simple design, a winter landscape, and inside it said only, "I'm sorry, Sarah." 3 words, different ones this time. I kept the card. I haven't replied to it. I haven't decided yet whether I will. What I had decided was this. I had learned the difference between a small life and a quiet one. Mine had always been quiet. Now it was also, irreversibly and completely, mine. The garden at the new house was producing more zucchini than any one person could reasonably eat. I gave most of it to the neighbors. They brought me tomatoes in exchange, and sometimes wine, and sometimes they just waved from across the fence in the golden late afternoon light, and that seemed to me, more often than not, exactly enough. The real lesson wasn't about the money. It was about a coat, about the thing you almost threw away before you checked. Check everything. Check carefully. And when someone tells you they already know your good news before you've spoken a single word, listen to that silence. It will tell you everything you need to know about